My point is that that way of thinking that we've got to, in terms of reducing the deficit or reducing the debt, cut education, is, if you follow my thinking, exactly the opposite of what we ought to be doing. Precisely the opposite, like 180 degrees opposite what we need to be doing. The only way of building the economy, the only way of generating higher real wages, and hence higher tax receipts, because taxes go with wages. The only way of doing that is to build up our workforce. And cutting education is like shooting ourselves in the collective feet. Every time you hear somebody talking about the debt or deficits, understand that the real issue is not the absolute number. The real issue is the ratio of the debt to the GDP, to the national economy. Right now, that ratio is not great because we've got some big expenditures we had to undertake with regard to that Great Recession. We probably have a lot more. We should do a lot more. But that ratio of debt to GDP is the issue. If the GDP grows, that ratio of debt to GDP shrinks. The greatest danger we face in terms of the debt is that our economy, that GDP, is not going to grow. It's not going to grow because there is not enough aggregate demand. There are not enough customers out there who have money in their pockets to turn around and buy. And one of the reasons there is not is this story I just told you of 30 years of coping mechanisms that have come to an end. The only way in which, in the short term, we're going to put more money in people's pockets is through a variety of tax reforms that I am reluctant to even talk about in open mixed company, such as exempting the first $20,000 of income from the payroll tax and making it up by subjecting incomes over, say, $250,000 to the payroll tax. But we don't even need to get there because the long term is more important. And over the long term, the only way we build American wealth and American incomes is through investing more and better in education. After World War II, the debt-GDP ratio was about 110%. That is huge. I remember I was a little boy in the early 1950s. I remember my father saying to me, Bobby, your children and your children's children and their children will be paying down the debt of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I didn't know what a debt was, but I was scared. I had nightmares that night, I remember, about a debt. But he was wrong. My father was right about almost everything, but he was wrong about this. Because by the end of the 50s, the economy had grown. We had made amazing investments in education, not only primary and secondary, but also as a nation in public higher education, in community colleges. We had, as a nation, dedicated ourselves. And we understood the importance of education. Part of it was the Soviet threat. Remember the National Defense Education Act? 1958. Part of it was the Soviet threat that made us invest in infrastructure. Remember the National Defense Highway Act? And how did we pay for all of that? Well, ultimately, we paid for all of that because as everybody got more and more income, because everybody was more and more productive, because everybody was better educated, tax receipts went up. There was a virtuous cycle for 30 years. I call it the Great Prosperity. I'm not saying everything about the 50s was good, or 60s, or 70s. In fact, if you watch Mad Men, you can see and refresh your recollection, if you don't know, about a lot of the problems of the 1950s. But here's something. By the 1960s, by the 70s, we as a society were expanding opportunity. We were doing whatever we could to expand the pie and expand the availability of education to more and more people, regardless of their color, regardless of their gender. But we did not do that after the late 70s and early 80s. Globalization and technology began wearing away at the American workforce, but we did not continue after that time to invest. We didn't continue to build the capacities of American workers. We didn't work at all of this any longer. We allowed things to get out of kilter. Under Dwight Eisenhower, who nobody would call a radical or socialist. I don't know anybody here who would call Republican President Dwight Eisenhower a radical. The marginal income tax on the top earners was 91%. Now, granted, there were deductions and tax credits and so forth. Even the tax rate was very, very high. Today, what are we debating in Washington? We're debating whether the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 should be extended for another year or more to the top 2%. Well, let me just tell you something. The people at the top do not spend nearly as much of their income as everybody else. We don't get much stimulation. In fact, we get no stimulus because people at the top already earn enough. They already buy as much as they want to buy. That's what it means to be rich. You already buy as much as you want to buy. But instead, with that $36 billion that would otherwise go to them if we extended the Bush tax cut, you know what we could do with $36 billion in this country? We could send it to the states and locales, and we could save teachers' jobs.